Hey sellers, welcome to another mission briefing. This one's going to be number 002, and it's going to involve Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of the island of Sicily. This occurred between 9 July, around midnight of 9 July, when the airborne glider troops started, to the actual day invasion on the 10th, and carried through to the 17th of August 1943. So let's get into it. Sicily lies in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, just off the tip of the boot that is Italy. It's approximately 200 kilometers from Tunisia, and the Strait of Messina, that little strip that separates Sicily from mainland Italy, is only about 5 kilometers or more in width. Its central strategic location offered the Axis a covered approach back and forth from North Africa to mainland Europe, and therefore was very critical to cover their resupply efforts to reinforce the Axis. Its location would offer an excellent jumping off point for an invasion into Europe through Italy for the Allies, and quickly became the focus of the Allied effort in the Mediterranean. Described as a jagged arrowhead with a broken point to the west, Sicily measures approximately 150 kilometers east-west and has about 600 kilometers of coastline. Very mountainous terrain with many peaks over 3,000 feet and separated by or surrounded by coastal plains and terraces. The largest plains were in the far west and around Catania. And of course, there was a large German airfield cluster, the Garbini airfields, in this location as well, which would end up being one of the primary targets for the Allied effort. We have four significant cities to worry about on the island, and they all became targets of the Allies at various points. First off was Messina, which ended up being the culmination of the campaign. Once Messina was secured, it was presumed that the island would be reduced, and therefore you could support further operations onto Italy proper. We also have Palermo in the north, which was the largest city on the island and had the largest port facilities, which were very critical to resupplying any Allied effort on the island proper. Unfortunately, given its position where it was in the north, it was also the least likely to be taken first. Although, in initial planning phases back in January 43, a original plan had Palermo as one of the primary objectives for the 7th Army as they would approach from the west. And then finally, we have Catania and Syracuse in the east. Syracuse, an ancient city, and still has minor port facilities along with Catania as well. Unfortunately, those two cities were not of sufficient quality to support the complete Allied effort, and therefore it was initially planned that they would be taken quickly. Initial supplies could be ferried in, but the main effort would be towards Palermo by the 7th Army. And once Palermo had been captured, then they could completely resupply all of the Allied troops. In addition, there were at least 19 known airfields as of January 43. However, by the time of the attack in July, that number had climbed to over 30. Most of that was manned by the Luftwaffe, and combined total, there's about 1,500 planes, about 800 German, 700 Italian, that were spread out over the island and using that as a base to support the campaign in Tunisia. These airfields became critical to the Allied effort, and therefore they must be reduced whenever possible. There was a large cluster around Garbini here in the just southwest of Catania, and as well as a couple around here, which ended up being the 7th Army's beachhead, and there's a large cluster here as well on the west coast. The situation leading up to Operation Husky was a concentrated effort made to reduce the Axis possessions in North Africa. No serious attempt could be made into Europe and Italy unless North Africa had been secured, and therefore it required significant effort on the Allied part. This was formulated in two axes of advance. One was the Operation Torch landings in November 42. These were the Allied landings in Morocco and Algeria, and their Anglo-American army would push eastward into Tunis. Meanwhile, you had the newly reinvigorated 8th British Army under Montgomery that would be coming in from El Alamein through Libya and into Tunisia as well. Between the two, they were able to force the enemy into the North African coastline around Tunis, and there they destroyed the Italian 1st Army and the German 5th Tank Army in May of 43. Once that was done, it actually paved the way to open a second front in southern Europe and thereby relieved some of the pressure on the beleaguered Russians. Stalin, for years, had been begging the Allies to open up a second front and just take some of the pressure off of his forces. And a hopeful byproduct of the invasion of Sicily would see Italy surrender and withdraw from the war. So, given its position in the Med, it was natural it would form an opening salvo of the Second Front, and as early as mid February, plans were tentatively agreed upon for roughly mid July. And then on April 15th, Chiefs of Staff decided that July 10 would actually be D Day during a favorable moon period, which would support airborne operations. And in order to deceive the Axis about their intentions, a very complicated operation was carried out called Operation Mincemeat. So Mincemeat is now a well-known secret mission that was pulled off successfully and involved depositing of a body in the Atlantic with false papers on him. And this was overall a deception plan to deceive the Axis about the forthcoming invasion of Sicily. The plans that were on the body involved Allied main attacks towards Sardinia, the Dodecanese Islands, and Greece. These were thought to be primary objectives by the Axis powers, while the activity that was directed towards Sicily would only be a feint. So important dates to consider. On 30 April, the body was found by the local fishermen near Helva, Spain. By 5 May, the body had been handed over to the government and Spanish sympathizers to the Axis cause, as well as aided by German agents, undoubtedly, were able to extract, secretly so they thought, documents from the body. This briefcase of documents was eventually returned to the British on the 11th of May. However, unobserved by the Spanish and the German spies, was a hidden eyelasher British added to the documents, which was missing when the briefcase was handed back. So this led the planners of this mission to believe that the ruse had worked. And then on 14 May, they started intercepting signals from the German High Command that seemed to indicate that the feint was successful. And this would eventually involve Germans reinforcing Sardinia, Greece, and the Dodecanese Islands around the end of May, with obviously believing the intent of the Allies to invade those areas. In fact, it's actually believed that Hitler postponed Operation Citadel, the Kursk offensive, in the belief that the Allies would be attacking Greece. Numbers, in terms of order of battle, are really hard to pin down. I'm using Wikipedia sources generally and what I could gather from General Sir Alexander's dispatches. Now, his dispatches were written just after the war ended in 46, published in the London Gazette. And based on that information, I was able to come up with these numbers. In general, at the start of the campaign, the Axis may have had a slight advantage in men. However, they would be spread out all around the island. The Allies, for their part, would be able to pick their targets more judiciously and could be established on the island before the Axis could react. So by the end of August, the Allies had probably almost 400,000 men on the island, while the Axis were slowly withdrawing, including most of the Germans. And by the end of the campaign, a majority of the Germans actually had evacuated back to Italy, and it was left to the Italians to bear the brunt of the assault. As early January 43, initial Allied estimates of enemy strength of Sicily was 8 divisions, all Italian, and this included 3 infantry and 5 coastal divisions. Sir Alexander calculated that 10 Allied divisions would therefore be sufficient to subdue the island, and that would be near parity in strength. But again, because the Axis had to surround the whole island with their forces, they'd be spread out, whereas the Allied will be able to focus their attacks and thereby gain beachheads more effectively. By July, however, there was real concern that several German divisions would reinforce the Italians, as well as the increased construction of many new airfields that increased the Axis air power on the island. Now, once the Tunisian campaign was over, none of the Italian and German divisions had managed to escape, and one of the fears originally was that as the Allies closed the noose on Tunis, that those Axis divisions would make their way across the intervening Gulf and support Sicily. So by June, Allied estimates of enemy strength in Sicily actually increased to 11 divisions. So they were reinforced with 1 Italian and 2 German divisions. Canada, for its part, lobbied strenuously for the involvement of the Canadian contingent. They'd been kicking their heels in England for 3 years, and after increased pressure from government delegates to the UK government, it was decided in April that an all-Canadian Infantry Division and an Armored Tank Brigade would end up replacing the British 3rd Division as part of 30 Corps under Montgomery's 8th Army. So this graphic shows Axis dispositions as of 10 July. Again, by the end of the campaign, the German and Italian combined defense was probably close to 400,000, including extensive Luftwaffe establishments. However, of that number, there's only about 90,000 Germans maximum, and approximately 60,000 of those would be evacuated to Italy as the campaign drew to a close, again, leaving the brunt of the assault to fall to the Italians. The overall plan for the defense of the island was that the Italian Sixth Army, led by a 66-year-old General Alfredo Guzzoni, advised by a German liaison officer, would command the Axis forces on the island. In the west, he'd have 12th Corps, while the 16th was headquartered in the east and central area with only a single division in the southeastern corner. There was two well-equipped divisions, the relatively elite Italian Livorno and the Hermann Göring, that were centrally located, and they were designed to act as a mobile reserve in case they had to respond. There were many defensive batteries strategically located on the island along the shores, along with significant anti-air defenses. However, the shore batteries, which was formed by the 5 Italian coastal divisions and numbered roughly 75 to 100,000 troops, forming the bulk of the Axis forces, tended to be of lower quality scale of troops. These division units here along the coast, they were very spread out. Sometimes you'd have a battalion covering 30 miles, which is too large for a battalion frontage. But these coastal batteries located along the edges were, as I said, tend to be lower quality scale of troops, generally poorly equipped and with minimal training. They actually possessed no anti-naval guns. So despite being coastal batteries, they were really weak horse-drawn artillery units. And the artillery pieces were fairly antiquated at this point. Again, these are rearguard troops, and they're not the highest quality, as opposed to the Italian Livorno division, which was comparatively elite. Still, based on the fighting that was going on in Tunisia at the time of the original plans, General Sir Alexander and his staff thought the Axis might be putting up a stiffer resistance than expected on the island. And in terms of numbers, again, at the beginning of the attack, the Axis powers may have had a slight advantage in terms of numbers, but again, because the Allies could pick their targets, they would be able to defeat those numbers by and large. However, it was generally perceived that Operation Husky was not without significant risk. As early as January, initially plans for a second front in Europe saw an invasion of Sicily coming from both sides of the island. You would have the American 7th Army, not though it wasn't called that at the time, would be attacking roughly from the west, while the British would be attacking from the east. However, other services that were involved in the planning, such as the air services, thought that splitting up the forces was untenable in terms of support and logistics, having to split up the naval support as well as diverting the aircraft to the two different beaches would overall detract from the effectiveness of the assault. Plus, it left many enemy airfields in the south of the island unattacked, and therefore a new plan was formulated and approved by the Chiefs of Staff when resistance in Tunisia finally ended in early May. That final plan would see two armies working side by side, the 7th American under General Patton and the 8th British under General Montgomery. The 7th would land in the south, while the 8th to the southeast around the Pacino Peninsula. Operation Husky, the code name for the invasion, was broken into 5 phases in this final plan. The first phase was a preliminary softening up by naval guns and bombers of the island's defenses to gain air supremacy. This would involve multiple sorties from Africa over the 7 days preceding D-Day. In fact, ever since Tunisia had been taken in the early May, Allied bombers and fighters have been making sorties over the island in addition to the other main bases on Sardinia and Italy proper, just to keep those areas suppressed as much as possible and cause a minimal damage. But it wasn't until 7 days preceding D-Day that a concerted air campaign was conducted against the defenses in Sicily, proving very successful because many airfields were unusable by D-Day, including the Bacino airfield, which was a target of the RCR on 10 July during the landing. And actually, the campaign had been so successful that many of the Axis planes ended up being sent back to Italy, where there was more safety from the bombardments. Second phase of the invasion would be the pre-dawn invasion by the two armies on the 10th, preceded that morning by glider and airborne landings with a view to capture the ports of Syracuse and Licata. Now, airborne and glider units were landed in the rear to secure these vital bridgeheads and key terrain roughly around midnight, 2300 hours on the 9th. And they had to obviously hold out against those forces while the beachheads were being secured, and then they can eventually be relieved by the ground forces. The third phase was the establishment of solid bases or beachheads from which assaults could occur on Augusta and Catania and the Garbini airfields near Catania by the 8th Army. Phase 4 would capture the ports and airfields outlined in Phase 3. So the main effort was again Catania securing those port facilities. Once Catania and especially Syracuse and Augusta had been secured and the Garbini airfields had been neutralized, then the way would be cleared to start offloading more men and material, and when they can carry out a more significant reduction of the island, which was the eventual goal of Phase 5. So you have the British in the east, roughly in the line of Ficino up to San Michele, Plaza Armenia, down to Valguarma, and then curl around to Mount Etna, while a similar movement was made up along the coastline. Meanwhile, for the American 7th Army, the push was to be to the west with a view to securing Palermo, and then from there a concerted effort onto Messina proper. On D-Day, the 7th Army's tasks were to include the following: capture the port of Licata, down here, and the airfields of Ponta Olivo, Biscari, and Camiso. So basically, the yellow line vicinity, secure that. They were to establish contact with the 8th Army so that they would link up and obviously not get in each other's way and protect those airfields and ports. And finally, their primary goal on that first day or the days following was to prevent any enemy reserves from moving eastwards and attacking the 8th Army as they approached Catania, which again was the primary objective in the initial days of the invasion. The 8th Army's task on D-Day included the following: capturing Syracuse and the airfield at Ficino, which again, because of the bombardments, had been effectively reduced. Even Allied planes were not able to land on it. However, it was could be quickly captured and repaired, and sure enough, Allied planes were able to land and continue the attack. They were also to establish contact with the 7th Army, again, roughly on the line from Syracuse to Ragusa. And finally, they were supposed to capture Augusta and Catania and the Garbini airfields. So once the beachhead had been secured, they would make a concerted effort to take Catania and the Garbini airfields, which are in this vicinity right here. Especially troublesome for the airborne glider troops for both armies was the unfamiliarity of the ground by the pilots and the heavy winds. Some of the winds approached 40 kilometers, and most units did not land where they were supposed to. In fact, the 82nd, which was supposed to secure the Pontalova airfield as well as the roads and high ground, were spread out over a 50-mile area, while in the east, the British Air Landing Brigade, originally composed of about 134 gliders, 50 landed in the sea, and only 12 actually landed around the vicinity of the Ponte Grande Bridge, which was their objective. Several hundred soldiers were killed on both sides because, again, of the unfamiliarity of the terrain by the pilots and the heavy winds. For Operation Ladbroke, which was a capture of the Ponte Grande Bridge, right here, was the first Air Landing Brigade's target, and only 8 officers and 65 men from the glider force made it. Again, many gliders, 50 of them landed in the sea. Most of the rest were blown off target. So as a result, you only had 8 officers and 65 men on the bridge, which they held for several hours. By the time they were relieved by approaching 5 division troops, only 19 all ranks were left. And this according to Sir Alexander's dispatches written in 46. But if you look at modern sources, it says that the British commandos were captured and by the Italians that were attacking the bridge. So I'm not sure which to believe, but again, Alexander writing in 46 says that they were relieved by 5 division troops. FYI, regarding this battle, there's actually 2 scenarios specifically that deal with this battle. One is LFT 242 in Lafranc-Carrier's number 14 magazine, again, Italians versus Brits. And the other one is Hazardous Movement number 8, which again deals with this attack. So, despite the effects of the wind and dispersal, the airborne glider forces that managed to land actually did an admirable job securing vital points, and they definitely created widespread panic amongst the Italians, especially the weak coastal divisions that saw these troops coming out of the dark, landing in the middle of nowhere. And it definitely disorganized enemy plans for the defense of the area. The Canadian British landings were generally unopposed. There were some remnants of coastal batteries in the area, however, they quickly surrendered when approached by the Allied forces, and there were no major combat troops deployed in the Pacino Peninsula, so the Canadians had a relatively unopposed assault as well. In fact, both armies faced little major opposition on the 10th of July, with some major fighting occurring near Gela. However, that was really not to take place until the following day, when the Germans and the Italians started making counterattacks on the beachheads. On the 11th, especially around the Gela beachhead, serious opposition to the form of the Hermann Göring and the Italian Livorno division. Again, those two mobile reserve units, centrally located in the vicinity, made their attack on the Gela beachhead. Um, it was one of the more intense battles of the initial invasion, and eventually it was repulsed with severe loss on the American side, and that was primarily because of the naval guns that were able to be employed to push back the German forces. So the Germans ended up getting their noses bloodied, but they did manage to reach the beach before they were actually repulsed. Looking at the overall campaign progress, Patton's 7th Army, he drove them hard, likely in a bid to be the first to Messina. So while he was on the west side of the island, he did not shirk in his duties, and he pushed his guys hard to the point that he had almost secured the western edge of the island by the 23rd of July. And he actually took Palermo the day previously on the 22nd. And then he didn't stop there. He pushed along the northern coast as well as into the interior. There's a little bit of friction at one point when when Montgomery is trying to find a way around the Etna line, sent his units into 2 columns, one on the left side of Mount Etna, one on the right, and it was the one on the left that actually encroached onto the U.S. territory, so there's a little bit of friction between the two forces, but generally speaking, Patton pushed his troops hard, and he was able to secure most of the northern coast as well. He actually engineered 3 amphibious landings to bypass stubborn defense, including Santa Agata at 7 August, Capo Orlando on the 11th, and later on the 15th as well. He engineered another one in the Gulf of Pali, finally entering Messina proper on 17 August. Monti's army, meanwhile, was engaged in securing the interior along with Catania, which he finally took on 5 August. 30 Corps, along with the Canadians, fought their way to Adrano through the interior, again keeping up a link with the Americans on their left. And finally, while he was delayed at the Etna line, which finally fell around 10 of August, Monty, again using amphibious landings, bypassed some Axis defenses with a hope to cut them off and help defeat that Etna line, which was holding up his attack. Unfortunately, Axis strategy, by and large, was to put up some initial resistance and then quickly retreat back to fallback positions. And this was the case around the Etna line. And when the commando landed at Scalata, Most of the Germans themselves actually had managed to escape and back to Messina, and from there they retreated back across the straits over into Italy proper. On 17 August, the commandos that landed at Scaletta were able to enter Messina itself, joining up with with Patton's troops that had entered in just the night before. And all total, it took about 38 days to take Sicily. However, again, 60,000 Germans were actually evacuated back to Italy proper, so they would have to be faced once the Allies made the push into Italy. So what happened? Operation Husky was a major Allied victory. German losses were relatively small, but there's only 5,000 killed, with another 6,600 or so taken prisoner. Italians lost 2,000, and 137 were taken prisoner. Overall, the Germans managed to ship back, as I said, 60,000 troops. Allied losses for their part were 7,400 Americans and almost 1,200 British Canadians, of which 2,310 were Canadians themselves. And finally, one of the expected outcomes for Operation Husky was that it would force Italy out of the war. This was achieved when Mussolini was arrested and the Italian king's new government began approaching the Allies in hopes of securing a peace, which was finally secured on 3 September as Italy surrendered. Again, this was not the end of Mussolini because he would eventually be rescued from his prison and he was restored as a nominal rump government up in the north, and he was able to continue to fight for a little while until eventually he was taken care of permanently when the partisans got hold of him. So let's look at some ASL scenarios now that are developed around Operation Husky. So ASL Scenario Archive has 118 scenarios all around July, August in Sicily. I was looking at this list earlier and I noted that only about half of them seem to have any kind of report. So while these other ones down here undoubtedly have been played, no reports on ASL Scenario Archive exist, so I'm not sure how they would work. There are a couple that I pointed out before. One was in that bridge again. This is Lafranc Terrier number 14. Again, this is Operation Ladbroke when the 1st Landing Brigade tried to take the bridge. And again, depending on which version you believe, either the Italians were able to capture the bridge again from the British and imprison them, or the 5th British Division managed to reach the bridge in time to save the beleaguered Air Landing Brigade. And of course, there's also the one from Hazardous Movement. This one again is from Hazardous Movement, as I said. Again, the 1st Air Landing Brigade attempts to capture Ponte Grande. I'm not sure how this one works. I don't have this magazine, so I don't have the scenarios that they offer. Interesting layout. And these are some links that I used in my research, so if you want to do some more research on those, by all means go ahead. This one up here, Bond of Strangers, is a really good one of the Canadians. It's a really interesting dynamic map, which shows you basically the route that the Canadians took. It starts off with their invasion landing points on Bark West, all the way up to Pacino, which they took on the 10th, and then from there it continues on into the interior, following the major progress of the various Canadian units that participated in the Sicily invasion. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom there, you can see how it basically follows the campaign interactively. So it's quite a nice little resource. And there we have it, Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily in July, August of 43. Yeah, it's quite an interesting little battle. Again, being a Canadian and having served in the Royal Canadian Regiment, one of the units with the 1st Canadian Infantry Brigade, as part of that 1st Canadian Division. We have a lot of battle honors that the unit earned in the process of helping him fight through Sicily. So it was interesting to do some research on the battle. there's too many battles to focus on specifically, so I was only able to gloss over them. I picked a couple of key ones I thought seemed important, like Gela and Operation Ladbroke. And because again, I'm Canadian, I want to focus on some of the Canadian efforts as well. But again, I didn't get too much into that because there's just too many, and this video is probably long enough as it is. So hopefully that's a teaser, and you use some of those links to find out more information if you care about this kind of military history, which I'm sure a lot of us do. And if you have any comments or questions on this mission briefing or what you would like to see next, please enter them down in the comments down below. Next up, my mission briefing is probably going to be the Battle of Liros, which is the Dodecanese campaign. Those number of islands between Turkey and Greece in the Adriatic. It was a bit of a debacle on the Allied side. The British thought they could take some islands from the Germans and the Italians. The Germans were having none of it, and they ended up taking them all back. It was actually one of the last major Allied victory, or excuse me, Axis victories of the war. So I'm going to do that mission briefing next. That'll be out in a few weeks. But yeah, so let me know what you guys think, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.